Welcome to Modern Mental Health. This is a podcast where we review modern takes and opinions on common mental health issues. In this episode, we'll be reviewing a fairly new podcast on the street, Mood Ring. I'm Christina Fulkerson, your host. This upbeat music is played throughout each Mood Ring podcast as host Anna Borges tries to keep the mood light and casual. Borges, a former mental health writer, created this podcast to offer people what she calls a practical guide to feelings.
And being a practical guide starts with saying that this show is not about finding the perfect self-care tips or the answers to all of our problems, because those tips, they don't exist.
Borges introduces her podcast in a very realistic way, stating the fact that there isn't one set of steps to follow to rid ourselves of our mental issues. She stresses the fact that we're all unique and deal with our mental health differently. Which brings us to this episode's review topic, coping mechanisms, specifically unhealthy ones.
This episode is about how we can stop thinking about them as shitty in the first place, and how we can tell when they're helpful or harmful, and how we can enjoy them without all of that guilt and shame.
Borges brings in mental health counselor Jor El Caraballo to talk about embracing our coping mechanisms.
Well, if coping is supposed to bring about some relief, if you're also feeling crappy while you're doing it, it's probably not the best strategy.
This is an interesting take on the idea of coping mechanisms as a whole, because it's almost mandatory nowadays to feel bad for binge watching Netflix or overeating, overspending as a way to cope with our life problems. Caraballo goes on to say how coping is simply meant to bring you momentary relief. It doesn't solve problems.
Coping mechanisms have no value.
Borges then goes on to ask about the guilt that we all feel from these bad habits.
Even though it's like what I want to do, I just feel like guilty and like crap and like judging myself and not enjoying it in the moment. Is that common?
In contrast to Caraballo's earlier statement of coping mechanisms having no value, he talks about how we as humans only have a certain limit, and that times of rest and recuperation are actually really important.
The truth is, humans need rest. They need coping. They need relief.
The overarching point of this podcast is to embrace your coping mechanisms rather than condemn yourself for them. This podcast offered a form of validation, saying that it's okay to have some unhealthy coping mechanisms if they offer rest and relief. This is very different from what society says today, which is get off your butt, no rest for the weary, and kill your bad habits. But this podcast challenges. Do we need to kill those bad habits? What do you think? Should we embrace our coping mechanisms with no guilt, or do we continue to try and rid ourselves of the bad habits? Let us know your thoughts on today's episode and what mental health issues you want to hear more about. You can find us on Instagram or Facebook at Modern Mental Health 834. See you next time!